The Mueller probe, it's done, but the report, even though out, it is far from the end of legal troubles for President Trump. New York Times is counting 29 Trump-related investigations that are still ongoing, including in that federal probes, state and local cases, and congressional investigations. Now, the Southern District of New York and the New York Attorney General's office both are handling some of the high-profile cases, including the record amount of money spent on the inauguration. Now, more than 2 years later, people are still trying to figure out where that $107 million went. D.C., that's another. D.C.'s Attorney General, they've just issued a subpoena for the woman that you see there on your screen, Stephanie Winston Wolkoff. She, a former advisor to the First Lady who was a planner for the inaugural festivities. She's now a cooperating witness with the feds, including those in Manhattan. Plus, a longtime friend of Trump's, Thomas Barrack. He's also facing some unwanted scrutiny. Barrack, he managed the inauguration, and now prosecutors are looking at where all that money came from, including in that possible illegal money from foreign dollars. Now, House Democrats are also probing Barrack's business ties to the Saudis. They're examining whether or not he used his influence to push a lucrative business deal involving the transfer of U.S. nuclear technology to the Saudis. Well, joining us to discuss that and more, former federal prosecutor and good friend to the program, Roland Riopelle. All right, Roland, let's do a little basic civics here. Explain what you've got the Attorney General working on while concurrently you have the Southern District and other different offices looking at as well. How do they get the different fiefdoms in order, and how do they make sure they're not looking at the same stuff?
A lot of it, Richard, is based on the concept of venue in a criminal case. In order to be able to prosecute a defendant in a particular venue or location, that location has to be connected in some way to the activity that constitutes the crime. And so the reason, of course, that there's so much of the federal investigation of Trump is being done by the Southern District of New York is that he lived here. Meetings related to all of these investigations occurred here. Telephone calls were made from here that may have furthered the conspiracies at issue. So the Southern District is going to clearly have a big piece of whatever investigation there is of Trump, simply by virtue of the fact that it's located here where Trump Tower is and where so much of the conduct at issue occurred. The same is true, of course, for the New York Attorney General. She has a great deal to look at, simply because Trump was here, his charitable foundation was here, and there's a great deal to look at on the state side here. In terms of the Department of Justice in Washington, there are, of course, many forms filed in Washington relating to the campaign and the inauguration ball and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of jurisdiction there in Washington, D.C. as well, to be looking at issues relating to Mr. Trump and his administration. How do these all get sorted out? When there's a battle between two United States attorneys' offices, like, say, the Eastern District of New York and the Southern District of New York, over who will get to follow through in a particular investigation and case, that's typically ruled on by the Attorney General. They take it up to the Attorney General, and he makes a ruling, and he says, okay, Southern District, you're going to do this case. Eastern District, you're going to do that case. And that's the way it happens. So in this case, there may well be some decisions being made in Washington as to where particular cases will be venued.
Let's first off with the Southern District, because it's known as the Sovereign District. In reality, how much do they operate as their own entity, and how much should there be a legitimate concern that all of a sudden Barr, who I think by most accounts certainly put his finger on the scale as it related with the Mueller probe, how it was released, how he characterized the findings, etc. How much does the Southern District act on its own, and how much will Barr decide who's doing what and how much he'll let out?
The Southern District still to this day, Richard, has a great deal of weight to throw around, partly because of its history. So many of the most important cases in the United States have been venued here and brought here. Many of the most important terrorism cases, the Rosenberg case, Ivan Boesky, just to give you a few examples of the types of very significant cases the Southern District has handled over the years. Given that history, they tend to have a sense of themselves as somewhat independent of Washington and the political clout to fight with the Department of Justice when they have to. With that said, over the last 20 years, some of that independence has been sapped away, particularly during the George W. Bush administration. Much more authority was pushed up to Washington away from individual U.S. attorneys' offices. So I don't think the Southern District of New York, although it is called the Sovereign District of New York, has the independence that it had 25 years ago. I think the decisions they make will be scrutinized by Washington. I think they will be, to some degree, controlled by Washington. And if Mr. Barr wants to put his thumb on the scale and prevent a prosecution, he can do that. There's likely to be political fallout, of course, and leaks about that may be damaging to him. But if he's willing to take that, he may well be able to affect the path that the investigation takes.
Roland, in addition to being a former federal prosecutor, you've had also a lot of high-profile clients in your second act. When you look at the Epstein case, is it the folks with the tinfoil hat that are worrying about conspiracies, or do you say this just does not add up here? Something just does not smell right.
You mean the conspiracy to assassinate Epstein in the jail? Is that?
Well, how it was all handled, Roland? How it was all handled in terms of when he was put on suicide watch, when he wasn't, the lack of oversight, considering how profile an inmate he was, all of that. When you put it in toto, do you look at it and say, wait a second?
I think the far more likely explanation here, Richard, is that negligence allowed Mr. Epstein to kill himself. I think he did kill himself. I don't think there's any real chance that he was murdered by anyone. He was left alone by guards at a time when he probably should not have been. But all indications that I can see in the limited number of tea leaves that I'm permitted to read in the case are that this was the result of negligence, not any nefariousness by anyone. And I think that's ultimately what the story will be. Mr. Barr is investigating the whole situation very vigorously, and he'll continue to do so. And I think when he comes to a conclusion, he'll announce it. And there may be facts that we simply don't know yet that do support the notion that somebody paid a guard to fall asleep at that particular point in time or something like that. That could be. But right now it looks like just negligence and Keystone Cops type of stuff.
I also do find it amusing that Barr acts as if Department of Corrections and everything else attached to this was some foreign entity, not under DOJ's watch. But besides that fact, Roland, do you think that what will come out, forgetting about the factors surrounding his death, some of the discovery as to some of the other players involved, will be more than eyebrow raising?
It's hard to say because, if things were really as bad as in my worst moment, I think they could have been. I think we would have seen more evidence of that before Mr. Epstein did commit suicide. We don't know what was in those pictures that were taken from his safe. We don't know a whole lot about what was going on in Mr. Epstein's life after the time that he pled guilty to. Remember, the Southern District's charges were all based on conduct that was more than 10 years old and that was already wrapped up in the plea agreement Mr. Epstein had signed in Florida. We just don't know if there's anything else that came after that. All of us suspect that there may have been, but if there wasn't, I think the whole thing is kind of a fizzle at this point. Although, we'll see. Again, time will tell. It takes a long time to do these investigations thoroughly.
Exactly, and all the co-conspirator questions and stuff will, one way or the other, shake themselves out. Roland, I always appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you for having me, Richard.
Now, when we come back, everyone, we're going to check in on the presidential race and also show you how even Fox News polls turn out to be bad news for one President Trump.